He knocked just before dawn, when the house was still holding its breath. Hey, the quilt in his arms was one I had folded away years ago, believing I would never see it again. He said my son's name once, and the silence I had lived with began to crack. Cat, I had lived alone in that house since my son disappeared, keeping time by the seasons and the creak of old floorboards. Winter light lingered longer in the mornings now, pale and uncertain, settling over furniture that had not moved in years. The quilt had been the last thing my son made before he left, stitched from scraps of old shirts and quiet evenings. When the stranger stood at my door holding it, I knew the past had finally found its way back. The house was awake before I was, not lively awake, just listening. The kettle sat cold on the stove. The clock above the sink blinked the wrong time again. Outside, the sky hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. Not night, not morning. That thin hour where everything feels unfinished. That's when I heard it. A knock, soft, careful. As if whoever made it might apologize if I didn't answer. I stood there for a moment, one hand on the counter, feeling the sound move through the floorboards. The house creaked the way it always did in winter, like it remembered more than it should. I thought maybe I imagined it. The quiet has tricks like that. Then the knock came again. I wrapped my sweater tighter, though the cold wasn't new to me. It had lived here a long time. I walked to the door slowly, the way you do when you don't want to rush into something you can't undo. And when I opened it, the air slipped inside first. Then the man. He stood just beyond the threshold, not quite stepping forward, not quite stepping back. His coat was dark and damp along the shoulders, frost still clinging to the seams. His hair was flattened by cold, his face pale like he hadn't slept much. His eyes lifted to mine, then dropped again, as if they'd already said too much. In his arms was the quilt, folded carefully, held close. For a second I didn't breathe. The quilt was mine. No, it was my son's, or maybe it belonged to the time before everything broke. Blue and brown squares, uneven stitching. A corner that never quite lined up, no matter how many times he fixed it. I hadn't seen it in years. Neither of us spoke. The quiet pressed in, thick as wool. Acha-fi-farta. Cold crept between us, pooling at our feet. Somewhere down the road, a car passed, tires hissing over frozen pavement. It sounded far away. "I'm sorry," he said finally. His voice was low, not shaky, just tired. Us. I nodded once, though I didn't know what I was accepting. The cold had settled into my hands, but I didn't move them. I was afraid if I did, this would disappear. Like breath on glass, he shifted the quilt slightly, as if remembering its weight. I noticed then how he was holding it. Not casual, not careless, like something borrowed. Like something that knew it needed to go home. I stepped aside. He hesitated, just long enough to ask without words. Then he crossed the threshold. The door closed behind him with a sound that felt louder than it should have. The house inhaled. Inside, the light was thin and gray. Dem first MLR, worser. Dawn was still finding its way through the windows, settling on the worn rug, the table by the wall, the framed photograph I never moved. The man stood near the door, unsure where to put himself. "You can." I started, then stopped. I didn't know what I was offering. He held the quilt out to me. When I took it, the fabric was colder than I expected. Heavy. Familiar in a way that stung. My fingers traced the edge before I could stop myself, following the stitching like a habit that never left. That's when I saw it, a tear, small but real. Near the corner I frowned. "I don't remember that," I said. He looked down at the quilt, then away. His jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, settled between us like an old understanding. "I noticed it too," he said. Later. The word hung there. I carried the quilt into the kitchen, laid it across the table. The wood was cool beneath it. The man followed, stopping a few steps back, hands folded together like he didn't trust them loose. The kettle was still cold. I didn't turn it on. I smoothed the quilt slowly, pressing out creases that didn't need fixing. Each square brought something with it. A night, a sound, a version of my son that felt both near and unreachable. My throat tightened, but I kept my hand steady. "How did you?" I began. He cleared his throat. I knew him," he said, "for a while." The clock clicked behind us. 1 second, then another. I waited. He shifted his weight, looked at the floor. The tile had a crack near the corner. "I'd learned to step over it years ago. He helped me," the man said, "when I didn't expect it." I nodded again. That sounded like my son. Outside, the sky brightened just a little. A pale line of light slid along the window frame, touching the edge of the table. Dust floated through it, slow and quiet. The man's eyes followed the light, then returned to the quilt. "I should have come sooner," he said. Something in his voice told me he'd practiced that sentence. Said it alone. "Let it sit unanswered." "How long?" I asked. He swallowed. "A long time." I reached for the torn corner, pinched the fabric between my fingers. The tear was clean, not careless. "Like it happened slowly. He always fixed things," I said, mostly to myself, even when they didn't need it. The man's mouth curved. Not quite a smile. Not quite sadness. "He did," he said. We stood there, two people connected by someone who wasn't. The Vaush listened. The house Celeste listened. The morning edged closer. Somewhere deep inside, something I'd kept quiet for years shifted. I looked up at him. "Why now?" I asked. He met my eyes then, really met them. His were red-rimmed but steady. "Okay, because I couldn't carry it anymore," he said. "And because dawn felt like the right time." The words settled. They didn't fix anything. They didn't need to. I folded the quilt again, slower this time. When I finished, I didn't move it. I left it where it was, in the open, in the light. The man took a step back. "I won't stay long," he said. I nodded. "But nardalakai de mam berdut." Outside, the first bird called, hesitant, testing the day. As the silence returned, it felt different. Thinner. Like it might finally let something through. I wondered, not for the first time, how many years a thing can wait before it decides to come home. Okay? The house smelled the same as it always had in the mornings. Old wood. Cooling tea. A faint trace of dust warmed by yesterday's heat. It was a smell you only notice when something unfamiliar enters the room, when the air has to make space. The quilt lay across the table now, spread wider than I remembered. Its colors had softened with time, blues fading into something quieter, browns worn thin at the edges. Morning light slipped through the window and rested on it, as if curious. The man stood on the other side of the table. He didn't sit, didn't lean. Just stood there, hands clasped, shoulders slightly forward, like he was bracing for something unseen. I touched the quilt. Not carefully, not gently. The way you touch something you already know. Harkan. My fingers moved on their own, following the stitching. Some lines were straight and patient. Others wandered, correcting themselves halfway through, then wandering again. I recognized the rhythm immediately. My son had stitched the way he lived, slow, thoughtful, never in a hurry to finish. I paused at a seam near the center. He always rushed that part. I pressed my thumb into the fabric, feeling the layers beneath. The quilt was heavier than memory allows, carrying more than warmth. It carried evenings with the radio low, scissors clicking softly, his head bent close to the work. It carried his quiet humming, the way he did when he thought no one was listening. Heckat. Across from me, the man watched, not openly, carefully. His eyes followed my hands, then lifted to my face, then dropped again, like he was waiting for permission. Or forgiveness, or a signal that he could begin. "You recognize it," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. My voice surprised me. It sounded steadier than I felt. I traced another seam, then another. The stitching grew uneven near the edge, where the fabric thinned and the needle must have fought back. I remembered him frowning there, lips pressed tight, refusing to cut a new piece. He hated waste. "He never measured," I said quietly. "Just adjusted." The man nodded. "He said that," he replied. Said measuring made him nervous. I looked up then. "How would you know that?" I asked. The question didn't come sharp. It didn't need to. It landed between us and stayed there. He took a breath, let it out slowly. "He talked when he worked," he said. "Not a lot, just things." The clock ticked on the wall. A long pause followed, filled only by the sound of the house settling into itself. The kettle remained untouched. "I hadn't realized how thirsty I was until that moment. I didn't mean to keep it," he said. I folded one corner of the quilt inward, smoothing it as I went. The fabric whispered under my palm. "How long?" I asked. He hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because he did. "Years," he said. The word sat heavy. I nodded once. Years made sense. Years had passed quietly here, marked only by changing light through the same windows, the same creaks in the floor. Years were easy to lose when no one was watching. "He gave it to me," the man continued. "Not all at once. At first it was just for the night." I stopped moving my hands. "For the cold," he added. He said I looked colder than I admitted. That sounded like my son, too. The man shifted his weight, glancing toward the doorway, then back at the table. He seemed unsure where to place himself in this room, as if the walls might remember him later. I tried to give it back, he said, the next morning, but he wouldn't take it. I waited. Yeah, he said it had done its job, the man continued. Said things should move when they're meant to. The quilt had moved, just slower than anyone expected. I reached the torn edge again. The place where the fabric pulled away, just slightly, like it had been tugged too hard once and never quite forgiven it. Yeah, that wasn't there, I said. The man's eyes followed my finger. His mouth tightened. No, he said. It happened later. How? He exhaled through his nose, a sound between a sigh and a confession. Han, there was a fence. There was a fence, he said. Rusty wire. We didn't see it in the dark. The word passed quietly between us. The quilt caught. He went on. He pulled. I told him to let it go. He wouldn't. I imagined it then, the night, the cold. My son standing firm over something already frayed, holding on because that's what he did. He laughed, the man said softly. Said it was already imperfect. My throat tightened. I swallowed it back. Sparks. The man looked at me then, fully this time. His eyes were searching, not pleading, as if he needed to know whether this memory was allowed to exist here. Slid as best I could, he said. But I wasn't him. I nodded. No, I said. You weren't. You. Silence returned, heavier now. Not uncomfortable, just full. I folded the quilt again, slower than before. Each movement felt deliberate, like an act of care. When I finished, I left my hands resting on top of it. You said you carried it. I said, yes, why? He looked down at his hands. They were rough, knuckles scarred in small, forgettable ways. And because it felt wrong to put it somewhere it couldn't be found, he said, and wrong to bring it back before I understood why I had it. The house creaked near the window. Dawn stretched further inside, lighting the floor in thin bands. What kind of man carries another family's memory for years without knocking? I asked. The words surprised me as soon as they left my mouth. They weren't accusing, just curious. The man considered them. Maybe the kind who didn't know how to give it back without breaking something, he said. I thought of all the things that sit quietly in drawers, letters never sent, names never spoken, truths waiting for the right light. I lifted the quilt and carried it to the chair by the window. Draped it there, where the sun could reach it, where it could be seen. The man watched me do it. His shoulders eased just slightly, like he'd been holding them tight for years. I didn't come to stay, he said. I know, I replied. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. Snow along the yard glowed pale and clean, hiding what lay beneath. A bird landed on the fence, then took off again, undecided. I stood by the chair, my hand resting on the quilt. For the first time in a long while, the room felt fuller, not crowded, just occupied by something honest. Yeah, the man stepped back toward the door. I'll wait, he said. If you want to ask more, I nodded. Not yet. As the door closed behind him, the house exhaled. The quiet returned, but it was different now, softer. Like it had learned something, I stood there a long moment, tracing the familiar stitch with my eyes. Some things are meant to be held, some things are meant to come back. And some memories, no matter how long they wander, always know the way home. The sun took its time that morning. It didn't rush the windows, didn't hurry the dark away. Light moved slowly across the floor, thin and patient, catching dust I hadn't noticed before. It floated there, suspended, like the house was holding on to every small thing it had gathered over the years. I stood near the table, the quilt still folded where I left it. The room felt fuller now, but not warmer. Just awake. I never knew where he went, I said. My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone standing farther back in the room. I didn't look at the man when I spoke. I watched the light instead, how it crept along the baseboard, how it paused at the leg of the chair. He didn't leave a note, I continued. Didn't say goodbye, just disappeared. The words settled between us. Heavy, familiar. The man nodded, not quickly, not surprised, like he'd been carrying that sentence with him already. The clock ticked. The house answered, with a quiet groan somewhere near the stairs. I realized then how long it had been since I'd said these words out loud, how strange they sounded when spoken instead of thought. Hey, Narama. All he left was that quilt, I said, finally turning back to the table. Folded. Like he meant to come back for it, the man's eyes moved to the quilt, then away again. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct me. He let the silence do its work. Outside, the sky brightened another shade. Dawn pressed closer, softening the corners of the room, revealing things I hadn't meant to see. Scratches in the wood, a stain near the door. The line stem had drawn across my own hands. Yeah, he vanished, I said again, just like that. The man exhaled slowly. He talked about home, he said. The words were quiet, careful, placed. I froze. Not the house, he added, but the idea of it. I sat down then. The chair creaked beneath me, protesting the suddenness. I hadn't realized my legs were tired until they were already giving in. What did he say? I asked. The man leaned against the counter, resting one hand there like he needed the support. He stared at a spot just beyond the window, as if the answers might be written somewhere outside. He talked often, he said, but never loudly. That sounded right, too. He didn't fill rooms, the man continued. He filled pauses. I swallowed. He'd say things when no one was really listening, he said. Or when it didn't feel important enough to remember later. The light shifted again. Dust sparkled briefly, then disappeared. What kind of things? I asked. The man thought for a moment. He talked about how silence can stretch, he said. How it can turn into something else if you leave it alone long enough. My hands tightened in my lap. Yeah, he said, some people mistake quiet for emptiness. The man went on. But it's not. It's full. Just patient. I closed my eyes. I thought of all the nights my son sat at the table, stitching, humming under his breath, the way I'd pass by, thinking he was fine because he wasn't asking for anything. The way I learned to measure his well-being by noise instead of presence. He talked about you, the man said. I opened my eyes. He didn't complain, he added quickly. Never that. He just wondered. Wondered what? I asked. If you knew how much he noticed, the man replied. How much he carried without setting it down. The room felt smaller then. Not tight. Just closer. I thought if something was wrong, I said slowly, he'd tell me. The man nodded, again, like this wasn't new. He said you were good at listening, he said, just not when things were said sideways. Can't. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Outside, a bird landed on the sill, pecked once at the glass, then flew off. Its reflection lingered a second longer than it should have. He didn't vanish because he wanted to disappear, the man said. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I could. And he vanished because he didn't know how to arrive, he continued. The words didn't break me. They didn't need to. They settled, slow and deliberate like snow. I stared at the quilt across the room, at the way the morning light caught the uneven stitching. The small mistakes he never fixed because they told the truth. He talked about coming back, the man said. More than once my chest tightened. He said he just needed to figure out how to explain the quiet first. I looked down at my hands. They were older than I remembered, spotted, veined, still capable. What stopped him? I asked. The man hesitated. Just a second too long time, he said. And the way it convinces you there's always more of it. The clock ticked louder now. Or maybe I was just hearing it differently. I used to think silence meant peace, I said. Kak offer hike or howl, tampikan. The man shook his head slightly. Sometimes it just means something hasn't found its voice yet, he replied. We sat with that, no movement, no rush. The house felt different again. Less like a place that had been waiting, more like one that was finally being spoken to. Dawn reached the far wall. Light spilled over a framed photograph, my son, younger, smiling without knowing why. The glass caught the glow, reflecting it back into the room. I never asked the right questions, I said. The man didn't argue. He said you asked the ones you knew how to, he said. That mattered to him, I nodded. Once, the quiet returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was layered, filled with words that had waited long enough to be heard. Outside, the day continued, unaware of what it had interrupted. I stood and walked back to the quilt. I placed my hand on it, feeling the weight of it settle into the table. What else did he say? I asked. The man looked at me then, really looked. He said silence doesn't last forever, he replied. It just changes shape. I traced the stitching again, slower this time, in the space between breaths. I wondered how many things my son had said into rooms that weren't ready to listen yet. And I wondered, now that the silence had finally stretched thin, what it might give up next. The morning had learned how to sit still by then. Light rested where it landed. Nothing hurried it along. Outside the window, the road lay pale and quiet, a thin ribbon of frost stretching into the trees. It looked ordinary, the kind of road you forget the moment you turn away. I had passed it 1,000 times without seeing it. That morning, it felt like it was waiting for someone to remember. The man stood near the window, his back half turned to me. He didn't look at the road. He looked just past it, as if the memory lived there instead. Or the memory lived high worse, sir. It was winter, he said. His voice didn't carry. It didn't need to. The room leaned in. A road like that, he continued, nodding once. Empty, no houses close enough to matter. I watched his reflection in the glass, the way his mouth tightened at the corners when he spoke. The way his shoulders stayed lifted, even now the truck had been coughing for miles, he said. Then, it just gave up. I imagined it then, metal ticking as it cooled, breath fogging the air. The silence after a machine admits it can't go any farther. He pulled over where the shoulder was barely there. The man went on. Snow kept falling like it didn't care what was underneath. I sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. I didn't drink it. I just held it, feeling the weight. He could have kept driving, I said. The man shook his head. He tried, he said, but the road had other plans. I closed my eyes. I saw my son there, standing in the quiet, coat pulled tight, listening to the wind scrape across the open land. He always listened first, as if sound might tell him what to do next. There wasn't much fuel left, the man said, and less daylight. Fair for Fopta Clord. And less daylight. He paused. The room filled the pause easily. Master Kambi Sanjatabrikest at a senforbups teted superweket, that perpsi kindful. I was walking, he added. Didn't expect to see anyone out there. Didn't expect kindness. I opened my eyes. You were the stranger, I said. He nodded. I was cold, he said simply. And I was wrong about how far I could go. That sounded familiar too. He didn't ask questions, the man continued. Not the kind that make you feel like you owe something. The clock ticked once, twice. He just opened the truck door and said, You'll freeze standing there. I smiled despite myself. It was quick, gone before it settled. That sounds like him, I said. The man's mouth curved faintly. Not quite a smile. He'd appeared. He shared what he had, he said. He shared what he had, he said. A piece of bread. A thermos that barely held heat. The quilt. My fingers tightened around the mug. The quilt, I repeated. He draped it over my shoulders like it was nothing, the man said. Like it wasn't stitched with hours and intention. He looked down then at his hands. At the memory resting there, he said warmth is meant to move, he added. That hoarding it doesn't make sense. Outside, a branch scraped against the side of the house. The sound traveled through the wall, slow and deliberate. They sat there, the man said, just waiting, not talking much. I pictured it clearly now, the way two people can share space without filling it. The way winter presses close, forcing honesty. He watched the road, the man continued, like he was waiting for something that wasn't coming. What was he thinking? I asked. The man hesitated. Yent, I don't know, he said. He didn't say it outright. He paused, then added, but he asked me if you ever feel like staying is harder than leaving. The question hit softly. Still, it landed. I stared at the tabletop, at the faint marks where my son's scissors had slipped once, long ago. I told him I thought leaving was braver, the man said. I didn't respond. He nodded, the man continued. But not like he agreed, more like he'd heard that before. The room felt smaller again, closer. He said, sometimes staying feels like pretending, the man said, like you're playing a part you didn't choose. I swallowed. He said, leaving doesn't mean you don't love what you're leaving, the man added. Sometimes it means you don't know how to love it without disappearing first. The words settled slowly. Like snow piling up without being noticed, I kept waiting for the rest, I said quietly. For the part where he turns back, the man shook his head. The truck started eventually, he said. Coughed again. Then caught. He looked at me, then really looked. He could have turned around, he said. Could have come home. Sechel Ferge. I nodded, but he didn't. I said no, the man replied. Silence followed. Not empty. Just heavy with all the choices that didn't happen. He handed me the quilt back, the man said. Folded. Careful, but you kept it, I said. Or from the cumber avec orge. But you kept it, I said. He nodded. He said I needed it more, he said. said he was lighter now. The word caught in my chest. Lighter. He drove off slow, the man continued, like he wasn't sure the road would keep him. I pictured the taillights fading, red against white, then nothing. He never looked back, the man said. I closed my eyes again. I thought of the house, the table, the chair by the window, all the places he had stayed, all the places he had left quietly, believing he was doing the right thing. Why that road? I asked. Papome. The man Drapel choose us tema to testamus tamasambal. The man shrugged. Sometimes roads choose us, he said. Sometimes they just happen to be there when we're tired. Oh. The ache grew then, not sharp, just wide. I felt relief knowing he hadn't been alone, knowing kindness had found him when it mattered, and yet something pressed deeper. Why leave everything? I whispered. A pumice for amka. The man didn't answer right away. He said he didn't know how to be both. He finally said who he was becoming, and who he had been for you. I nodded slowly. Ka. The quilt rested in the chair by the window, catching the light. It looked like it always had. And yet, it felt changed. He said, roads don't ask you to explain yourself, the man added. They just let you go. Outside, the frost began to melt where the sun touched it. Water slid quietly into the dirt, disappearing. The story ended there, but it didn't feel finished. It felt like a sentence that had paused mid-breath. I looked at the road outside one more time, at how easily it disappeared into the trees. And I wondered, if my son had taken a different turn, would he have known how to come back? The light had settled by then, not bright, just enough to show what had been there all along. The quilt lay between us on the table, folded the way it always had been, careful, deliberate, as if it understood the room better than we did. The morning had quieted into something steady. The clock kept time without asking anything of us. Outside, the road had gone back to being just a road. The man sat across from me now, not close, not far. His hands rested on his knees, fingers still, like they'd learned not to move unless necessary. He stared at the quilt, not at me. I kept it, he said. He didn't rush the words. Didn't soften them, hustatan soften them. I shouldn't have, he added. I waited. The house knew how to wait. It had practiced. He cleared his throat once, then again. When he spoke, his voice was lower, slower, as if he were stepping carefully over thin ice. Chop-ta-ba-cha-da. I kept it because I thought I failed him, he said. The sentence landed gently. Still, it landed. I told myself I was protecting something, he continued. But really I was hiding. I folded my hands together. The skin there felt looser than it used to. Time does that quietly. How did you fail him? I asked. He didn't answer right away. His eyes followed a crack in the tabletop, tracing it like a map that led nowhere. There was a night, he said. Later, after the road, the room shifted. Not physically. Just enough to notice. Okay. He came by where I was staying. The man went on, didn't say why. Just said he needed a place to sit for a while. I pictured my son standing in a doorway, hands tucked into his sleeves, waiting to be let in without asking. He looked tired, the man said. Not the kind that sleep fixes. He paused. I told him I couldn't help him, he said. The word stayed there, bare. I had my own mess, he added, as if that might explain it. Bills, trouble, the kind of things that make you small. The kind of things that make you small? I nodded slowly. I knew that kind of small. He didn't argue, the man said, just nodded. Like he'd expected it, the clock ticked. Once. Twice. He left the quilt behind, he continued, folded it like he always did. Said I might need it more than he did. My chest tightened. I didn't stop him, the man said. Didn't follow him outside. I told myself he was strong, that he'd find his way. His hands clenched then. Just briefly, then relaxed again. Never, just briefly, then relaxed again. I never saw him after that, he said. The silence thickened. The quilt absorbed it, holding everything we weren't saying. I looked at the fabric. At the familiar stitching, at the tear that had refused to heal. I thought if I brought it back, the man said quietly, it would mean I admitted I should have done more. More. I lifted my eyes to him, and if I kept it, he added, I could pretend the story wasn't finished. I swallowed. I know that feeling, I said. He looked up then, met my gaze. His eyes were wet but steady. I should have asked him why he left, I continued. Should have noticed the pauses, the way he lingered in doorways. First, I looked down at my hands. I thought silence meant he was fine, I said. I thought no news was good news. The man nodded. I thought distance meant safety, he said. I thought not getting involved was kindness. We sat there, the truth stretching between us, thin but unbroken. I replay it, he said. That night, over and over, I nodded again. Parents learn how to do that early. I replay mornings, I said, evenings. All the times I could have asked a different question, the quilt lay still, patient, heavy with what it had carried. I told myself shame was respect, the man said. That holding on to the quilt honored him. He shook his head once, but it didn't, he said. It just kept me from facing what I'd done. The light shifted across the table, touching the quilt's edge, then moving on. I used to think guilt fades, I said. That time wears it down. I paused, but it doesn't, I continued. It just learns new places to sit. The man let out a breath that sounded like relief. I didn't want to hurt you, he said. You didn't, I replied. He flinched. Just slightly, I hurt myself, I added. Long before you ever knocked, the words surprised me. They felt true the moment they left my mouth. The man looked down again, nodding slowly, like he was setting something down at last. I carried the quilt because it was easier than carrying his face, he said. Easier than remembering how he looked when he realized I wasn't coming with him. I closed my eyes. I imagined my son standing alone in the cold, holding himself together the way he always did. Quiet, capable. Still hoping someone would notice. I should have said his name more, I said. Should have asked him to stay. The man's voice was barely audible when he spoke again. He said you loved him, he said. He never doubted that. I opened my eyes. He doubted whether he'd might print for faldigt bo from upbraid. He doubted whether he fit, the man added. The room felt smaller. Not tight, just close enough to feel the truth press in. I loved him the way I knew how, I said. Yeon, so did I, the man replied. We sat with that, with the understanding that love doesn't always arrive in the shape it's needed. The quilt shifted slightly when a draft passed through the room. The fabric lifted, then settled again, like a breath. I thought shame was mine alone, the man said. I didn't realize it could belong to two people at once. I reached out then, just enough to rest my hand on the quilt. It doesn't belong to either of us, I said. Not anymore. He looked at my hand, then at the quilt, then back at me. What does, he asked. The guilt, I said. It belongs to the quiet, and the quiet has had it long enough. The words felt fragile, but real. Outside, a car passed. Life continuing, unaware of the small reckoning happening inside this room. The man straightened slightly, like someone who had been carrying weight without noticing how heavy it had become. I didn't come for forgiveness, he said. I know, I replied. I came because I couldn't hold it anymore, he added. I nodded. Neither could I said. The quilt lay between us still, but it felt different now. Less like a burden. More like a witness. The house creaked softly, as if acknowledging the shift. I folded the quilt once more. Slowly, carefully. When I finished, I left it where it was. Some things aren't meant to be put away again. UMA. As the silence settled, it no longer felt accusing. It felt shared. And for the first time since my son left, I wondered if guilt, spoken aloud, might finally loosen its grip. Not disappear, just move, enough to make room for whatever truth was still waiting to be told. The light shifted again without asking permission. It slid across the wall, climbed the edge of the cabinet, then settled near the window like it meant to stay a while. A grayish to robber sock for. The house had grown quieter in a different way, not the kind that presses on your ears. The kind that listens back. I sat where I had been sitting all morning. The chair knew my weight. The floor creaked beneath it, the same way it always did, like it remembered every time I'd lowered myself into that spot, hoping for answers that never came. The man stood near the window again. He seemed to prefer being close to exits, or maybe close to light. I couldn't tell. He didn't go far at first, he said. I looked up. After he left me, he continued. He followed the road until it thinned into something smaller. His hand lifted slightly, gesturing toward the window, though what he was pointing to wasn't there. A town, he said. The kind you don't plan to stay in, I nodded. I knew those towns, places built around passing through. He rented a room, the man went on, not his, borrowed, over a garage, I think. I pictured it immediately. Narrow stairs, a low ceiling, a single window that rattled when the wind moved wrong. Did it have heat? I asked. The man paused. Barely, he said. Enough to take the edge off. That sounded like something my son would accept without complaint. He worked where he could, the man said. Odd jobs. Repairs. Things people didn't want to do themselves. I imagined my son with his sleeves rolled up, hands steady, fixing what others had given up on. He'd always liked things that needed patience. He said the pay wasn't much, the man added. But it felt honest, I smiled faintly. Honest mattered to him more than comfort ever did. He didn't talk about staying forever, the man said. Just staying long enough, for what? I asked. Yeah, he shook his head. I don't think he knew, he replied. Bers beide hinesterpas trapash. Oh, he replied. The kettle finally whistled then. Sharp. Sudden. The sound cut through the room like a reminder that time was still moving. I stood, turned it off, poured the water without thinking. The steam fogged my glasses for a moment, blurring everything. When it cleared, the man was watching me, not closely, just enough. I imagined him there, I said, setting the mug down. At night, when the town went quiet, the man nodded. Yeah, he stitched, he said. The word settled into the room like it belonged there. He found scraps, the man continued. Old shirts, torn sheets, whatever people didn't need. I closed my eyes. I could see it clearly now. Lamplight pooling on a small table. The quiet hum of a bulb. My son bent over his work, needle flashing briefly before disappearing again. Quadip for fasher. He said the quiet was different there, the man said. Not heavy, just open. I thought of the quiet here, how it had felt sealed shut after he left. He was learning how to be someone new, the man added. Yeah, the phrase lingered. I wondered who that someone was, and whether I would have recognized him. He wrote, the man said. Heck. I looked up. Letters, he clarified. More than one, my chest tightened. Did he send them? I asked. The man shook his head slowly. No, he said. He folded them. Put them away, where? I asked. In a drawer, he replied. In a desk that wasn't his. I stared at the tabletop, at the faint ring where a mug had once sat too long. I thought of all the drawers I'd opened and closed over the years. All the places where things go to wait. He said writing helped, the man continued. Even if the words never left the room, what did he write? I asked. The man hesitated. His eyes shifted, just briefly. He didn't show me, he said. Not the words themselves, but, I prompted. But he talked about them, the man replied. After, I wrapped my hands around the mug. It had cooled enough to hold now. He said some truths need practice, the man said. Before they're ready to be spoken, I nodded. That sounded like my son too. Kya? He said letters are a way of listening to yourself, the man continued. Without interruption, the room felt smaller then. Or maybe fuller. I imagined the letters, the careful way he would have started them, the pauses between sentences, the words he crossed out, then wrote again because the second time felt closer to the truth. Did he write to me? I asked. The man didn't answer right away. Yeah, he addressed some of them to Mom, he said finally. The word hit softly, still it found its mark. But he never finished, the man added, not in a way that felt final. I closed my eyes. I wondered how many times my name had been written, then set aside. How many sentences had died quietly in that drawer, believing they were protecting me. He said he didn't want to explain himself before he understood himself, the man said. Said explanations can become excuses if you're not careful. The clock ticked. The house held its breath. What would those letters have said? I whispered. The man shrugged gently. He said one was about the house, he replied, about how it always felt like it was listening. I smiled despite the ache. He said another was about silence, the man went on, about how it can feel like love if you don't know what else to call it. My throat tightened. And another? I asked. The man looked at me then, really looked. Stegsappran. He said one letter was just questions, he said. No answers. Space. I nodded. I understood that kind of letter. Rooster. He never mailed them, the man said. He said once you send something, it stops being yours. I stared at the window, at the faint reflection of my own face layered over the morning outside. How many truths die quietly in desk drawers? I asked. The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. I imagined the desk, the drawer sliding shut, the letters resting there, patient, believing they still had time. Did he seem happy? I asked. The man considered this carefully. He seemed steadier, he said. Like he wasn't pretending as much. That felt like both comfort and loss. He talked about you when he stitched, the man added. Said he learned patience from watching you wait for things to make sense. I let out a breath that felt older than the room. He planned to send the letters, the man said. Eventually. When? I asked. When he figured out who he was writing from, he replied. The light shifted again, touching the edge of the quilt in the chair. The fabric glowed briefly, then settled back into itself. Hemmerting Fascher. I pictured my son at that desk, pen hovering, listening to the quiet the way he always had, believing the right moment would arrive if he waited long enough. Some moments don't knock. Can't, they pass by softly, assuming we're not ready. The man stepped back slightly, as if sensing the weight of what he'd placed in the room. Yeah, he left the letters behind, he said. Just like the quilt? I nodded. Et tonder factionam belukt. Some things are easier to leave than to explain. I sat there long after he finished speaking, imagining drawers opening in rooms I would never see, words folded carefully, truths resting unfinished. Outside, the day continued unaware. Inside, the quiet felt crowded now. Filled with voices that had almost spoken, I looked at the quilt one more time, at the stitches that held despite unevenness. And I wondered if those letters had been sent. Neat? Would the silence between us have learned how to say my name differently? The thought stayed with me, waiting. The snow began before anyone was ready for it, not the gentle kind. The kind that arrives early and refuses to apologize. I remember the sound it made against the window that morning, soft but persistent, like someone tapping to be let in. The light outside had turned pale, the color of unfinished thoughts. Even the trees seemed unsure of themselves, branches bent under a weight they hadn't agreed to carry. The man sat across from me, his hands folded, his coat still on. He hadn't taken it off all morning, as if winter might follow him inside if he did. This was the last winter, he said. He didn't add anything else, he didn't need to. I waited. He cleared his throat, then looked down at his hands. They were rough, the kind that had learned how to hold on and let go at the same time. The snow came early that year, he said again slower. He said it felt unkind. I nodded. I knew that kind of winter. The kind that doesn't just close roads, it closes choices. The house creaked as the heat kicked on. It sounded tired, like it had already lived through too many seasons. They were staying closer then, he continued. Not together, just near. Near was a dangerous word. It made everything feel possible. They could have reached each other if the weather had allowed it, he said. If the roads hadn't disappeared under all that white. I pictured my son looking out at the snowfall, calculating distances the way he always did, measuring what it would take, what it would cost. He talked about coming home, the man said. Yauk, the word home landed carefully between us, like something fragile. I didn't respond. I was afraid if I did, the sound of my voice might undo me. He said it more than once, the man added, not in a promise, just out loud. Like he was testing how it felt. I stared at the wall behind him. At the faint shadow where a picture once hung before I moved it. He asked about you, the man said. About whether you still kept the porch light on in winter. I swallowed. I did, I said quietly. I still do. Wall. The man nodded, as if he'd expected that. He said the light always made the house look like it was waiting, he continued. Cat. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires crunching against leftover ice. The sound faded quickly. Front Hambatens for puer Farschweid frast. He said he thought about driving, the man said, even with the snow. What stopped him? I asked. The man hesitated. He said the roads weren't just closed, he replied. They were erased, I imagined that. Familiar turns buried, landmarks gone, everything looking the same no matter which direction you faced. Too bad of Stas. He tried once, the man said. Got as far as the edge of town. And? I asked. And he turned back, he said it felt like pushing against something that didn't want him to pass. The silence stretched. He talked about time differently that winter, the man went on, said it felt thicker, harder to move through. I knew that feeling too. Time that doesn't flow, just accumulates. He wrote another letter, the man said. Kansa klapsamfaro gasa. I closed my eyes. Did he finish it? I asked. The man shook his head. He folded it halfway, he replied. Like he wasn't ready to decide who it was for, the kettle clicked softly as it cooled. A sound so small it almost felt personal. He said coming home would mean answering questions. The man continued. Not just yours, I waited, his own, the man added. The room felt colder then, though nothing had changed. He worried that if he came back too soon, the man said, he'd become who he was instead of who he was trying to be. Yeah, that hurt in a quiet place. He said winter has a way of making decisions for you, the man continued. Even the ones you think you're choosing. I looked down at my hands, at the thin veins beneath the skin, at how much they'd aged waiting. Jan, he was closer than you think, the man said suddenly. I looked up. Closer how? I asked. The man's voice faltered then, just slightly, like a step on ice that doesn't quite hold. He stayed one night, he said, in a place halfway had always been dangerous too. He said he could almost feel the house, the man continued, like it was just beyond the trees. My chest tightened. He stood outside, the man said, in the snow, long enough for it to soak through his boots. I pictured him there, the cold biting, the quiet pressing in. What happened? I asked. The man looked at the floor. He turned away, he said. Before dawn. The words sat heavy between us. Why? I whispered. The man took a breath, held it, let it go. He said he didn't want the last thing he gave you to be disappointment, he said. The floor creaked as I shifted in my chair, like it remembered that sentence, too. He said if he came home and left again, the man continued, that might hurt more than staying away. The snow outside began to fall again, light this time. Almost gentle, that winter lingered, the man said. Longer than anyone expected, I nodded. Some winters do. He talked less after that, the man added. Spent more time staring at the lamp. At his hands, I imagined the stitches slowing, the needle pausing more often. He said winter teaches you what you're made of, the man said, but only after it's done taking. The clock ticked steady. Unforgiving. That was the last season we were near each other, the man said. Near again. What happened when spring came? I asked. The man didn't answer right away. Yao, spring didn't fix everything, he said finally. It just made the roads visible again. The light in the room shifted, catching on the edge of the quilt. The fabric looked warmer than it should have been. I kept the porch light on that whole winter, I said. Even when the power flickered, the man nodded. He said he could see it sometimes, he replied. Trup we Nanyan dan team Hilton Narian Douther comforted Nanyami. From places he couldn't explain, the thought both comforted and broke me. We sat there for a long moment, listening to the house, to the snow, to everything that hadn't been said when it still might have mattered. Yukek, half. The man stood slowly, as if careful not to disturb what remained in the room. That winter changed him, he said. In ways I don't fully understand, I understood enough. After he left, I went to the window. The snow was lighter now, almost kind. It settled where it landed without complaint. I turned on the porch light, even though it was still afternoon. Some habits don't need reasons. As the glow reached into the falling snow, I wondered, if he had taken one more step that night, would winter have let him pass? The question stayed with me, waiting. The quilt lay on the table again, quiet and heavy. Cat. The edges softened from use, but the weight remained. Light from the window pooled across it in long, lazy rectangles. Shadows stretched across the folds, carrying the memory of hands that had held it. Foten thangs pa never not an hunder fakes, pressed it, folded it, and never let go. The man sat across from me, his coat still damp from the morning's frost. He didn't move much, but I noticed the way his hands twitched slightly when he thought no one was watching. I was supposed to bring it back years ago, he said. He didn't look at me. He looked at the table, the quilt. Somewhere behind it, I waited. The house waited too. I never had the courage, he added finally. The words landed softly, but they dug into the silence between us. I lifted my hand and touched the quilt. Its fabric felt worn, familiar. The seams pressed against my fingers like a heartbeat I hadn't felt in years. I thought about it every day, he continued, every day since that winter, and then life moved forward. I nodded slowly. I understood. Life had a way of moving, even when we weren't ready. I went places I didn't expect, he said. Worked jobs I didn't imagine myself doing, met people I shouldn't have. I thought, maybe I'd outrun the quilt. Or him. or both, outside, a car passed slowly, crunching ice under its tires. The sound faded quickly, leaving only the hum of the heater. It stayed with me, he said, folded, unfolded, waiting. Like a quiet accusation I couldn't answer, I thought about the quilt at home, how many times I had held it, smelled it, and then put it down. How it had absorbed my own worry, my own silence. I realized something, he said after a long pause. His voice was lower now, hesitant. Silence can be a way of hiding. I let the words settle. Have you been hiding? I asked softly. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he traced a finger along the edge of the quilt, over the tear that had never fully healed. I noticed his thumb press gently against the worn stitching, almost reverently, I think. Yes, he said finally. I hid in the quilt, in memories of him, in every excuse I could name. I thought that keeping it meant keeping part of him safe, but it also kept me small. I closed my eyes. I thought about the winters I had spent worrying, the nights spent staring at the doorway, waiting for a step I never heard. Had I hidden too? Perhaps in my waiting, in my avoidance, in thinking that silence would protect me from loss. Yeah, the truth, he continued, is that I owed you this. The quilt, yes, but also an answer, a reckoning. I never found the words before. I reached out and touched the quilt. It smelled faintly of the cold outside, of wood smoke and memory. I felt the weight of years pressing into my palm, folded into every square and stitch. You should have come, I said quietly. I know, he whispered, his shoulders slumped slightly. I know. The room felt warmer, though the light was pale and indifferent. Dust motes floated in the beams, slow and patient witnesses to our confession. I imagined him, I said, looking down at the quilt. At night, stitching by lamplight. Wondering if anyone would ever see him. He thought about you, the man said. Every time he stitched a square, every time he folded the quilt back into itself. He carried the hope that you'd understand, even from afar. I exhaled slowly, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I hid too, I admitted, in waiting, in thinking that if I left the quilt alone, if I ignored the absence, it might fix itself. That maybe silence was protection. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. The quilt isn't just fabric, he said. It's memory, responsibility, regret, hope, all folded together. I felt the truth in that, a heavy, unspoken truth. I should have returned it sooner, he said, not just for you, but for me, for him. For the years we all lost waiting, the floor creaked under my shift. The sound felt like it remembered all the steps taken here, all the steps not taken. I don't want to be small anymore, he said. His voice steadied. I want to carry it, not as a burden, but as a bridge. I lifted the quilt slightly, letting the light fall across it. The tear glimmered faintly, like a scar in slow motion. Perhaps silence only protects until it becomes weight, I said. Yes, he replied, until it becomes heavier than the truth. We sat together, quiet, with the quilt between us. Not just as a barrier, but as proof of everything that had happened, everything that had been avoided, and everything that might yet be faced. The window rattled once in the wind, small and sharp, a reminder that the world continued outside. Snow dusted the edges of the roof. The day was moving forward, unrelenting and patient. I've carried this long enough, he said, and you've waited long enough. I touched his hand briefly. Not reaching, not grasping, just acknowledge, not grasping. Just acknowledge some promises, I said, aren't broken. They're delayed, waiting for the right words. He nodded. Okay, the quilt lay between us, folded and unfolded, a testament to absence and return, to courage not yet found, and courage finally given. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the weight of years just enough for us to breathe. I looked at him, then at the quilt, then back at him again. We can start again, I said softly. Yes, he whispered. We can, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel like hiding. It felt like space to be reckoned with, space to forgive, space to remember what had been lost without losing what remained. The light shifted across the table again. Dust motes danced slowly, patient, as if witnessing something they had waited decades to see. The quilt remained, heavy, familiar, and finally in the right place. I realized then that some absences can end. Some silences can break, and some promises, long delayed, can finally be kept. The morning light was weak, spilling across the floor in pale, hesitant strips. Absauf Arsträr Stecke. The quilt lay folded on the table, heavy with years and memory. I traced the worn squares with my fingertips, feeling the ridge of each stitch, the slight unevenness that my son had left behind, like a signature in soft fabric. The stranger sat across from me, his coat still damp from the walk, his hands folded neatly on the table. He didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he stared at the quilt as if it were a fragile bridge he dared not cross too quickly. "Yeah, I need to tell you," he said, voice low, careful. "About him." I nodded, though my chest felt tight. The air itself seemed to hesitate. He didn't send a final message, he continued. No goodbye, no letter. Just. His fingers brushed the edge of the quilt. Just the wish that it reach you eventually. The room held its breath. The heater clicked once. A car rattled past on the frozen street outside. Tiny sounds that seemed enormous in the quiet. "I've carried this too long," he said. "And it's time you knew the truth." I leaned closer, not impatiently, not demanding, just needing the weight to shift from the air to words. "He died," he said, bravura quanapa 9. "He died," he said. Simple, clear. Fran, it's hung. The words hung there, heavy but steady. They did not shout, they did not plead. They simply were. I closed my eyes, felt the quilt beneath my fingers, the weight of all the winters, the absences, the folded-away hope. He was. "Careful," the stranger said, cautious in everything, but that night his voice faltered briefly. Dot. He was tired, so tired. And alone. It was cold, unforgiving. I imagined him there, shivering, stitching, counting the snowflakes outside a window that never opened. I imagined the light from the lamp dancing across his hands one last time. "Yeah, there was no message because he couldn't send one," the man said. "No final words. Just a hope, hidden in the quilt. That someone would understand." I felt my understand. I felt my breath catch. The air seemed to thicken. I've apologized every day," he continued. "Not just to you, to him, to the years that passed, to the silence, to myself." I looked at him. The lines in his face mirrored my own grief, though shaped differently. Guilt had a quiet way of carving into a person, leaving angles that never softened. "The truth," he said, slowly, "is that he trusted you in the only way he could." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The room was full of things too long unsaid, full of snowed-in roads, late nights, and quilts folded and unfolded in memory. "He asked me to return this," he said. "I were aduffer our tassasaif and ham in your page," he said, tapping the quilt lightly. "Not for him, but for you." So the weight could finally shift where it belonged. I reached out and touched the fabric. It smelled faintly of winter, of dust, of distant fires. The stitches pressed softly against my palm. "Even now," he said, "I can't imagine how heavy it must feel to finally know." I didn't answer immediately. I let the words settle. I let the truth press against the quiet corners of the room. "It's not the ending you wanted," he said. "I know that, but it is an ending." I nodded slowly. It wasn't a story with a reunion, a confession, or a final hug. It was a story with snow, distance, and absence, but also with presence in its own stubborn way. He died quietly," the stranger continued, "without ceremony, without attention. Just cold. And apology. And hope folded into that quilt." I pressed my lips together, felt a familiar ache, the kind that does not vanish with words, but also a stillness I hadn't felt in years. A gentle settling. "Did he suffer?" I asked softly. "No," he said. He was ready. In his own way, he was ready. And he trusted that you, would understand one day. I thought of the many nights I had imagined his final moments. The fantasies of confrontation, reunion, or rage. None of them had prepared me for this quiet truth. And yet, in its simplicity, there was something I could hold on to. "The quilt," he said, gesturing gently. "It carries him to you. Not as alive, not as gone, but as he wanted to be remembered." I touched it again. Its fabric warm under my fingers, its weight steady. "I can feel him here," I whispered. "Even like this." The stranger nodded, finally meeting my eyes. There was a tremor there, relief, sorrow, years of waiting. "I was supposed to tell you sooner," he admitted, "but I couldn't. Life moved, fear moved, I moved. And and the quilt waited. I let that hang. I did not ask why. I did not need to. The quilt had waited. So had I, do you? Forgive me? He asked quietly. I paused. For fucky frufoft. Took a breath. I forgive the waiting, the silence, the years. His shoulders loosened slightly, though the weight of memory remained. Even now, he said, the truth can offer something, not peace as it is imagined, not comfort as it is pictured, but something steady, something I hope you can hold. I nodded. I could hold it. Slowly, carefully, the light in the room shifted. Dust floated lazily in beams that had traveled across years of absence. The quilt lay between us, both a barrier and a bridge. I realized that endings are rarely grand, rarely loud. They arrive quietly, in moments too small to notice until they have passed. I will take care of it, I said softly. The quilt, his memory, everything he left behind. You will, he said, a whisper heavier than words, and it will finally belong where it was always meant to. The wind rattled the window once, a small reminder that the world continued outside, indifferent and steady. I pressed my hand to the quilt again, felt the thickness of the fabric, the ridges of stitch or squares. Felt him in it, felt my son in it. I can hold this, I said quietly. I can finally hold this. The stranger stood slowly, careful not to disturb the room more than it already had been disturbed. This is for him, he said, voice fading toward the door. For you, and for everything between. I watched him go. The door closed softly. The wind carried nothing but the quiet. The quilt remained. Folded, heavy, familiar, and the truth settled like snow, steady, cold, and certain. I looked down at it one last time. The tears came slowly, quietly. Not with rage, not with pleading, just with understanding. It was not the ending I had imagined. But it was the ending I needed. Outside, the snow fell again. And for the first time I felt the space for peace, even late, was still possible. Sunlight broke through the windows in slow, deliberate streaks. It wasn't bright, not yet, but enough to chase the shadows from corners where dust had settled. For years. The quilt lay between us on the table, heavier somehow, yet lighter too, as if it had carried all the waiting, the absence, and now allowed a small portion of hope to seep in. I watched him shift his weight, the stranger who had carried so much more than fabric, whose footsteps had echoed quietly in memory before he ever walked through my door. He didn't meet my eyes at first. Instead, he studied the quilt as if it were alive, breathing under the morning light. I began, unsure if words would be enough. I want to thank you. He blinked. Just once. Surprise flickered in his tired eyes. Not many had thanked him for carrying another family's memory for decades. For what? He asked quietly. For everything, I said, my voice steady but small. For returning him, for telling me the truth. For this, I gestured to the quilt. It felt different now. Not just a relic of absence or guilt, but a vessel of memory, of care, of all the quiet courage my son, and this man had shown in ways I could only finally begin to understand. The room softened with the sunlight. Dust motes danced in the beams, slow and patient, like witnesses to our long conversation. The heater clicked in small intervals, a rhythm steady and forgiving. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the subtle movements of the house, the floor settling, the wind against the windows, the distant hum of life continuing outside. The weight of years was there, yes, but so was a strange, tender relief. I can feel him here now, I whispered, almost to myself. My hand brushed the quilt lightly. Not as gone, not as absent, just here, he nodded, finally meeting my gaze. The faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. Not a triumphant smile, but one born from shared understanding, from duty completed, from the acknowledgement of a burden lifted. Cat porsa tampiter sat or suppa protectimus kine, wascata pumps and over softly one. It's lighter now, he said. Or maybe, I'm lighter. I don't know which. Perhaps both, I offered softly. Perhaps both. I ran my fingers along the stitching one last time, feeling the uneven ridges that had always been part of my son's hands, part of the story of all he had given quietly, unseen. I never imagined it would feel like this, I admitted. Not the end, not the relief, not the soft light in a room that has held so much absence. He glanced at the window, where the sun now painted the walls with gentle gold. Some things, he said slowly, don't end the way we expect, but maybe that's enough. Enough to let the light in. We both fell silent again. Not the heavy, anxious silence of uncertainty, but a quietude that allowed the truth, the quilt, and the years between us to settle naturally. "I want you to know," I said finally, my voice catching, "that the waiting, the grief, the not knowing, it doesn't vanish completely, but it shifts, it changes shape, it allows space for forgiveness, and perhaps for peace." He nodded, his eyes tracing the folds of the quilt, the edge where a small tear had always reminded me of unfinished stories. Peace, yes, perhaps, maybe, slowly, but it can come, the house itself seemed to exhale. The floorboards creaked softly, not under weight but in agreement, acknowledging our shared reckoning. The sunlight inched higher, spilling warmth into the corners we hadn't dared touch in years. "I forgive you," I said, more to the room than to him, though he heard it. "Not for what you did or didn't do, but for everything you carried that wasn't yours to bear alone." He swallowed, the gesture slight but visible, as if years of holding back were finally easing. "And I forgive myself," he murmured. "I think I needed to hear that too." The quilt rested between us, folded but alive with memory. I realized it was no longer just fabric. It was connection, witness, testament. It carried sorrow, yes, but also something lighter, something resilient and patient, love, carried quietly for years. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of mourning, of light, of everything settled, yet still fragile, I think. I paused, letting the words find their place. I paused, letting the words dot. "I think it's time to let the light in fully." He rose too, careful not to disturb the stillness of the room, careful not to tip the balance of years. He reached for the door, hesitated, and then turned once to look at the quilt, at the room, at me. Thank you," he said softly, "for letting me do this, for letting it end properly." I nodded. "Thank you for finally bringing it home, outside." The wind whispered through bare branches, carrying the faint scent of winter's end. Sunlight spilled across the porch, painting everything in quiet gold. The day had begun, not loudly, but fully. He stepped through the door. The floorboards creaked as if they remembered every step he had taken before, every hesitation, every year of absence. I remained by the table, fingertips lingering on the quilt, feeling warmth that wasn't just from the sun. Warmth from completion, from truth, from the long, patient process of finally letting go. The door closed softly behind him. The house was quiet again, but in a different way, not empty, not burdened, but settled, breathing, waiting only for the next story to unfold. Now, I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, letting the sunlight wash over the quilt, over the room, over me. And for the first time in years, I felt the space to forgive. Not only him, not only my son, but myself. The quilt remained on the table, heavier and lighter all at once. Memory and love folded into fabric, into light, into the quiet that followed. I realized then that letting the light in wasn't about ending the past. It was about carrying it differently, carefully, gently, openly, and for the first time the light felt like it could stay. The door closed behind him with a soft click. I stayed where I was for a long moment, hands lingering over the air where he had stood. Sunlight streamed unevenly through the kitchen window, cutting the shadows into long, patient lines. The house smelled faintly of the tea I'd poured hours ago, now cold, and of the faint lingering scent of his coat. I could hear the floorboards settling, a low groan as if the house remembered every footstep he had taken, every pause in the silence that had stretched for decades. I carried the quilt carefully, folding it with slow precision. Each crease reminded me of years held in waiting, of hands I could no longer touch. I placed it on the chair by the window, where the sun caught the worn stitches and made them glow faintly in gold. It felt alive, not with my son's presence, not exactly, but with memory, with intention, with the quiet devotion of someone who had carried a story for me when I could not. I breathed in slowly, and then I spoke. "Tommy," I said, his name soft, deliberate. It rolled through the room like a leaf drifting on still air. No answer came, of course. The silence remained, but it had changed. It was no longer a heavy door slammed shut. It was a room, breathing, waiting, holding. I moved through the house slowly, letting each step be measured. The floor creaked gently, as if it too was learning how to hold the truth. I passed the table where the quilt had lain all these years and traced my fingers over its surface. Feeling the uneven seams, the places where thread had pulled against itself and created small hills in fabric. I remembered my son's hands there, patient, learning, creating. I remembered the nights I had spent wondering, the days marked by absence, and the stranger's quiet courage that had finally carried the weight home. Outside, the day moved on, indifferent but bright. Cambirds called from the branches, a distant dog barked, and somewhere a car rolled over gravel. The world did not pause for grief, for memory, or for the truth that had finally been spoken. Yet somehow, the room, the house, and I could. I sat by the window, quilt draped across my knees, and let the light wash over me. The shadows of the corners seemed gentler now, softened by the knowledge that silence could hold honesty, could hold love, could hold someone long gone without crushing the living. "You can." I spoke again, Tommy. This time it was less a question and more a sharing, a bridge between absence and presence. I thought of all the unspoken letters, the roads not taken, the winters endured quietly. The stranger had returned what he had carried, yes, but more than that, he had shown me that truth, even late, could fold gently into the quiet. And perhaps the quiet itself had learned how to hold it. I walked through the room slowly, touching surfaces, opening a cabinet, pausing at the old wooden chair by the kitchen table. Each object was a memory, a whisper of the past, and each felt different now. Lighter, patient, unafraid. The quilt waited by the window, a silent witness, a companion to grief transformed into reflection. I realized then that speaking my son's name aloud had shifted something. The silence did not vanish, it would never vanish, but it no longer pressed against me like a wall. It had become a room with space, room for memory, room for remembrance, room for love that did not vanish when the bearer was gone. I picked up a small cup, still holding faint traces of tea, and let the warmth fill my hands. The steam curled into the light, dissolving quietly, carrying with it the remnants of nights spent wondering, mornings spent empty. And still the quilt lay by the window, sunlight glinting along its worn folds, waiting patiently for each day to pass, holding memory without demand. I spoke again softly. "Tommy, I see you, I hear you, I remember you." The words did not echo. They settled, sinking into the walls, into the wood, into the threads of the quilt. I felt no sudden comfort, no instant healing. But I felt presence, connection, the acknowledgement of everything that had been left unsaid, finally given a place. Outside, a breeze stirred the trees, scattering leaves along the driveway. A car passed on the road, its tires whispering against gravel, indifferent to my quiet revelation. Yet in the room, in the sunlight, in the folds of the quilt, there was movement, too, a subtle, almost imperceptible breath of continuity, of story preserved, of silence learning patience. I returned to the window, hands resting lightly on the quilt. The warmth of the sun was gentle, a reminder that light can enter slowly, that time can soften edges, that silence can be patient and hold more than emptiness. I let myself imagine him here, smiling faintly. The boy I had loved still present in thread and memory, still alive in my acknowledgement. The clock ticked steadily, a companion to the quiet. I spoke once more. "I will carry you now, in the light, in the quiet, in this home." No reply came. No presence but memory and warmth. But it was enough. Enough to let the room breathe, enough to let me breathe, enough to allow silence to break without shattering. I stood slowly, feeling the floorboards creak beneath me, each groan a soft echo of the years past. I touched the quilt one last time, folded it neatly, and left it by the window where the sunlight would catch it every morning. It was a small act, but it mattered. It meant presence, acknowledged, memory folded into living. I opened the door to the day outside. Light spilled over the threshold, and I let it touch my face, warm and patient. For Blaffertatandishanade. The world continued, The world continued indifferent, bright, moving on, without pause. And I realized that I had changed. Not because the past had vanished, but because silence had finally learned how to hold the truth without crushing it. I whispered his name one final time for the morning. Tommy. And for the first time in years, I felt the quiet answer. Not with sound, but with space, with light, with memory kept tenderly. And the quilt waited in the sunlight, the room held its breath, and I stepped forward, carrying grief, love, and remembrance together, learning at last how to let silence and life breathe. The day moved on, and so did I.